We're driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Just go to Indeed.com/Blue Wire right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
From your favorite source for Chicago White Sox talk, delivering news, interviews, analysis, and more. This is the Sox Machine Podcast with your hosts, Jim Margulis, James Fegan, and Josh Nelson.
Thanks, Rob, and welcome everybody to a special midweek edition of the Sox Machine Podcast. I'm Jim Margulis, managing editor of SoxMachine.com, and I'm joined today by Keith Law of The Athletic, who posted his annual top White Sox prospects list among dozens and dozens of other rankings. Prospects for every team, he ranked them. Top 100 prospects in baseball, he ranked them. Top farm systems in baseball, again, he ranked them. And now he joins us to talk about his rankings of the top White Sox prospects ahead of the 2024 season. Keith Law, thanks for returning to the Sox Machine Podcast, returning champion. I've been enjoying your work all week, and I imagine you're glad that it's getting out there and it's finally off your desk, literally or figuratively.
The majority of it is. I think I still have 8 teams left to write up. So we took the weekend. I took the weekend off. We did a big family ski trip up to the Poconos. I am not a good skier. I like it. I want to be better. And I'm always reminded that I'm not. But I want my kids to be. My daughter, my stepdaughters are all better skiers at their ages. That they've all been skiing before I ever went for the first time in my life. So in that sense, I think my wife and I are doing a good job.
It was funny. I had a outline all neatly written up, and then Baseball America drops this report this afternoon, Tuesday afternoon, talking about how the complex leagues the schedule is being changed to be bumped up to start in early May rather than early June. So the schedule ends before drafted players can get involved. And your initial reaction was one of dislike. Yeah. And I want to get your thoughts on that because I could see a few different reasons to dislike it. I saw in Baseball America, maybe a few months ago, they talked about what's the point of extended spring training as is? Why can't they make it actual games? So I think there was a movement to start that season earlier, but to then eliminate all the games in the back half of the schedule seems kind of short-sighted.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not a fan of anything that reduces opportunities for players to play. And that is both in terms of actual games, but also levels. I have been screaming into the void for several years now that eliminating short season, the level between the complexes and low A, was going to be deleterious for player development. There's a whole large group of players who absolutely need that intermediate step. And I'm going to highlight in a bunch of these team by team top 20s. I'm going to talk about here's a player who needed short season. Here's a player who needed short season. I just feel like I have to keep saying it over and over again because it's true. It's really hurting a lot of player development.
George Wolkow is one for the White Sox that you singled out.
Yep, absolutely. I think he's the perfect candidate for that. Brandon Winokur for the Twins is another one that comes to mind. There are also a lot of international free agents of that who are going to, they'll play it. They're ready for the comp. They do the DSL. They're ready for the complex league. They're not ready for low A. And all that this thing today seems to do is it's just going to push some of these draft kids to low A. How are you going to send a kid you just drafted maybe to low A and then tell him the next year, actually, we're going to keep you back in the complex instead? Now it feels like he's been demoted. So to me, that hurts. It is all about, I mean, everything Major League Baseball does on this front, I just immediately assume it's all about saving money. I don't think they care about anything else at all, other than saving money, reducing their costs. And it doesn't matter how trivial the cost is, right? It's penny wise and pound foolish. And I think that in this case, we're going to lose players. We're going to lose players are still going to come into the sport, but they're not going to develop like we want it. We're going to keep finding that we don't have as many players as we think we should. Oh, where's the pitching? Where do all the shortstops go? Where do all these players go? Because we are not developing them. We don't have the appropriate steps. We don't have the appropriate levels in place. And also because I think what's also going to happen is I think it's going to encourage some players who are kind of on the bubble to just go to college. Say Major League Baseball is saying, we'll let the colleges develop it.
Yeah.
Right? No, let them spend the money. I don't want that. Colleges are not good at developing players. Actually, I might argue on the whole, there are individual colleges that do a good job, but on the whole, college baseball has sucked at developing players for pro ball. They're fine at developing players just for their own purposes. That's their role in the ecosystem. And so I don't want to see us farming out, no pun intended, the job of developing players to the colleges, because I don't think they're really capable of doing it, not in the way that we need, where we're looking often at these very, very long-term time horizons.
It was funny, that story broke around the same time that there was a lot of social media posts about the new Fanatics jerseys in clubhouses, talking about how cheap they look. And it struck me as like a little bit too perfectly parallel, just two tracks of just cutting corners, and look just how bad it looks on its face for like not even for casual fans, just saying like, wait, how does less baseball make sense? How does not getting drafted players that you're excited about following right away, like for fans who are like, oh, this high school player, what's this all about? I'm looking forward to seeing his box scores in the ACL or the Florida League. And all of a sudden, like, they're kind of not there for the first couple of weeks. You forget about them. And then spring training comes around like, oh, I hope this player is good, who was a complete mystery and nobody had any look at him. And when you read your top prospect list or any of them, like nobody really has any good looks that allow them to kind of base good expectations for very young players who have a long way to go.
Teams are still going to scout whatever they do, because they're going to hold fake games. It's going to be like instructs, like extended spring, like the so-called tricky league that they used to do in the DSL, where
alternate training sites, kind of.
Yeah, they were unofficial games. And look, I'm kind of fine with that, because I do think it is, at some points in the year, for folks who don't know, in those other games, those unofficial games, the biggest difference is you can roll an inning. So if a pitcher's just thrown too many pitches, he can't get the third out. Sometimes he can't get the first out. That's fine. You just say roll them, and you just change sides, because nobody really cares who wins. It means you don't have stats to keep track of. And I mean, for those of us who are kind of on the outside, that's not great, but that is still, they're still holding games. These guys are still getting some kind of playing experience. And you can also do things like, oh, so-and-so needs to lead off every inning because we're trying to catch him up on at-bats because he's getting over an injury. You can do that in these alternate games. I mean, that's fine. However, the idea of taking a guy in the draft, and this is particularly true for high schoolers, right? This doesn't really apply to college guys because they've had more experience. They're older. They're probably ready to go to low A. Occasionally they're ready to go to a higher level. But for high schoolers to say, all right, now you're just going to go play fake games the rest of the year. Really? I don't know. To me, I could imagine a high schooler saying, well, this sucks. This isn't what I signed up for. And maybe that does encourage some of them to go to college instead, which I don't really want, because I do think major league teams on the whole do a better job of developing those teenage players than colleges do.
Well, it's funny to say that we can shift to a more positive topic and say the White Sox farm system, because you actually rank them 10th, which was a pleasant surprise. Is it fair to say Keith Law kind of likes the White Sox?
I do kind of like the White Sox. I kind of like the things they've been doing. And, that goes back to the draft last year, and I would actually say the last couple of drafts in general. They've done a decent job with some trades. And I would say that I like the hire of Chris Getz. We'll see what he, actually does over time in the job. But I was definitely an optimist, at least when they first made the hire. I've known Chris for a couple of years. Certainly on the player development side, he has a lot of good ideas. He said a lot of the right things. I think we did see some development, certainly a lot of different things and generally better things happening on the player development side for them, which is particularly good to see. And so, yeah, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic on things over there. They don't, well, I know we'll go through the system a lot. They don't have a lot of depth. And somebody did point out to me, I'd ranked them higher at least once before. So this isn't the highest I've ever ranked the White Sox, but it may be the best I've ever felt about the White Sox. And I know it's not exactly the same thing, but I do. Yeah, I don't put my vibe doesn't go into the rankings, but I feel good. I feel like an optimist. If I were a White Sox fan, I'd say, hey, I think the arrow's pointing up now. It hasn't been pointing up in a little while.
Yeah, when you were on the show last, we talked about Chris Getz because you voiced an optimistic or at least open-minded view of what he might be able to bring to the position if he got the right kind of support from above. And, that's always the big question when it comes to the White Sox and Jerry Reinsdorf and the way just their chain of command often gets really warped and tangled. But his first, now that he's made some hires, he's made some trades, he's, spoken on record a number of times, like, how has that informed your decision so far? Reinforced it, altered it? What have you heard from other people in terms of, staffers he's hired, like the recent trades he just made with trading Christian Mena for, and Gregory Santos and bringing in Dominic Fletcher and Zach Deloche. Like, how has this all added up to, I guess, fill out the picture of Getz he had in mind initially as he starts in this job?
I mean, the one thing I'll say that I think is probably the best thing, it's that everyone's complaining he's asking too much for Dylan Cease. I'm like, good. He should. Don't ask for too little. What would you rather if you're a White Sox fan? Now, this is not White Sox fans complaining necessarily. This is other clubs. They're asking for the sun and the moon. Sure, he should. It's his most valuable player to potentially trade. So, yeah, he absolutely should do that. So that's a positive. I think the trades so far, they've all been pretty minor. They're a little bit of a mixed bag for me. I thought Christian Mena, I think I probably valued him slightly above Dominic Fletcher. You could also argue he's a pitcher. Fletcher's a position player, right? That cancels that out. Thought the trade with Seattle was great. That is, I think Joe Sheen even wrote this. Like, this is what bad teams do. Get a reliever with some promise or even a starter you can stick in the pen, sort of polish them off, right? New coat of paint, and then turn around and trade him for something, some package of player or players, right? That will more benefit you in the long term. That's great. Love to see that. Hope Getz continues doing that. Saw some comments from him today about saying Kopech still a starter for him. That could be just talk. I do think at some point you probably want to just think about putting Kopech in the bullpen. Also to think about trading him at some point because he's not had the kind of extended success as a starter that I certainly forecasted for him. The White Sox foresaw when they traded for him. So, maybe at some point you say, well, what's the best way to maximize the value of the time we have left with Kopech? Maybe that's just sticking him in the bullpen and seeing if he performs better, and then you can trade him at some point later on. I think we'll have a much better sense on Getz when we get to August 1st, once we've been through a draft and a trade deadline, and also seen some of the moves he makes with the major league roster over the course of this season too. I'm very curious to see how they deploy certain players, for example, or how they choose to develop certain guys. Are they, the whole idea of let's run everybody into Birmingham. Well, some guys benefited from that. Some guys didn't. What kind of those ideas that was a Getz idea? Do they continue some of these things? Or do they say, it was a good experiment. Don't think it really worked out well enough. Let's try something else.
When it comes to the farm system and the Birmingham connection, a lot of those guys in your top 100 were Birmingham guys. You had especially Colson Montgomery at 42. I was interested by that ranking because when I saw the ranking before reading the blurb, I thought, oh, you don't think he's a shortstop? Because if he has to move to third because he's not going to stick at shortstop, obviously his value takes a hit, and obviously reduces his value somewhat in this big against other prospects. But you had him. You're optimistic about his forecast at short. So is the ranking kind of middle of the top 100 more about whether he'll regain? Like, are you concerned that the lack of fluidity he showed at shortstop last year was due to the oblique and back issues and, kind of guarding against that? And you think like he can shed that off, or you think that's going to possibly stick with him next year?
There's a couple of things. I mean, Colson just didn't look right last year. And I know some people felt like the performance was fine and he hit better at the end. everybody I talked to who saw him said he did not look like himself. He was not moving as freely.
If I may interject real quick, like I was watching him at the end of the season with Birmingham, and I was taking photos of him. So I had my camera on him, like in between pitches. And I noticed like a lot of shoulder rolls, neck twists, kind of back bends, hip, flex, kind of like a lot of motion. Then I was like, I'm going to look at other players between pitches, and you see like playing with the lace of the glove, kicking the dirt, but it seemed like a lot of twitching, a lot of stretching and such. And so I wondered, if that was related to that, if that was a case of just, that's what he always does. And I've never just paid attention to him that closely between pitches. So I'm curious, when I saw you mention that the teams were still wondering if he was, stiff because of that, I kind of wondered that too.
Yeah, it was like he just didn't seem to play, didn't seem to have the same flexibility, didn't seem to have that same kind of fast twitch action that he'd shown before. Like his whole game seemed slowed down. He looked sluggish. He really didn't look good in fall league, and I certainly understand why they sent him there. But, at the same time, he didn't look good. I mean, he just did not at all look like himself. And I got a lot of reports, calls from texts from scouts during the latter half of the season. We're like, why is Colson Montgomery, why is he considered a top 10 prospect in the game? This guy's definitely not a shortstop. I don't even think he's got that much power. Like, all right, we got to somewhere, right? The truth on this one is probably somewhere in between, right? He's, maybe not the whatever fifth best prospect in baseball, but he's also not, like, if you had no other information, just saw this guy play in the second half of 23 and or in fall league, you'd probably say he wasn't a top 100 prospect at all. And I don't think that's right either. I also do have some concern, right? Anytime there's back problems or anything in that area, right, those can last and they can end up affecting a guy's career over the long term, and they can end up forcing a change in position. Like I've always said, I thought Colson had I talk about him like I know him personally, but there's too many Montgomerys in baseball, and I'm just used to referring to him by his first name. Now we got another one in the draft this year too in Braden, so I'm going to be even more confused. But like I've always thought Colson had the hands and the instincts and certainly the arm to stay at shortstop, and it was probably just going to come down to how big the body got. But I've seen him make plays at shortstop, as now this is going back 2 years, that made me say, there's nothing right now that says he's not a shortstop. There may be going forward something, maybe the body changes or he slows down or something. Right now, this guy could stay at shortstop. Last year, if you watched him, you're like, I don't know. I don't know where to put this guy. Is it second base because we don't know where else to stick him? That's not fair either. And so ranking him where I did was a reflection of all of that uncertainty, that it's not that he stunk last year, that we realized he wasn't as good as we thought. It's that he never looked right. He was probably never fully healthy. I do worry that the injury could recur or affect things long term. And yeah, he didn't take a step forward last year. He could take another step forward this year. Maybe he gets fully healthy this offseason. The injury's behind him. He takes a step forward, and then I move him back into, I think he was in my top 20 a year ago. And I would be comfortable if you told me you had a crystal ball and the injury was never, ever going to be an issue again. Nobody can ever promise that on any player. But the idea, right, then he'd be in the top 20. I do. I bought it. I didn't love the pick at the time based on the information I had. And then I went and saw him. No, this guy's actually really good. I think he's very talented. I think he's got great instincts. I like the swing. I do think there's going to be enough power. I'm probably more like 60-40, 50-50 on shortstop. But if he's not a shortstop, he's a very good third baseman. There's a lot to like here. I'm just trying to reflect the reality of the situation and what teams think. That is the other thing that always shows up on my list, even though ultimately it's my opinion. If multiple scouts, multiple teams are saying, we have this, or models don't like him as much, or I think he's too high, that gets reflected in my list as well, because I can't do it alone. I'm one person. I don't see every player. And even if I did, you can't be right on every player. You just can't possibly gather enough insight to be able to do that without reaching out to trusted sources.
Okay, then the rest of your top 100 was Edgar Caro at 67, Brian Ramos at 69, Nick Nastrini at 76, and Noah Schultz at 79. And we talked about Caro the last time you were on, and I think he's shaping into like a good catcher and probably can stick at the position and could be a good on base guy with some pop. But what's interesting to me about the system is that it has some bald spots in the system, particularly the outfield, which is why they had to add Fletcher and Deloche. But like catcher is pretty interesting for them. Like when you look up and down the system, like you think about all the potential starters you might have at the four levels, and you kind of, whether you like them, it's worth watching them. Like I'm thinking like even Corey Lee and Carlos Perez are there and they look like third catchers, at most right now. But like Adam Hackenberg, he's keeping the door open and making himself interesting by just making, slight improvements year over year. And, Michael Turner did, probably feasted on high A pitching, being a little bit older for the level, but like he showed what he could last year. Ronnie Hernandez is somebody who's aced his 2 assignments so far in rookie ball, DSL in the complex league. And so I'm really looking forward to watching him in Kannapolis to see what he's all about. But this actually looks, for catchers, given the scarcity of them around the league, like this actually seems like a potential area of depth, like, maybe at the deadline or a year from now.
Yes, I think that's fair. I mean, you also, it's a position where if you can acquire depth, you love to, because they get hurt all the time and they develop on, I agree with the old axiom that catchers do take longer to develop because you're basically asking them to learn 2 jobs and everyone else only has to learn 1. So I think there are a lot of things, a lot of reasons why you might say, hey, we have all this catching depth, but you know what? That's so far from a sure thing versus having like a lot of center field depth, for example. I look at the Dodgers, where a year ago, Will Smith, obviously they have in the big leagues. Diego Cartaya will look like one of the best prospects in baseball. And Dalton Rushing came out and hit 405 in his brief time after the draft. And then a year later, Cartaya had just an absolutely awful season across the board. And even scouts were saying, we're not giving up on him, but he's probably just not a star at this point, which is really disappointing because he looked like a star. And Rushing, he had the concussion. He didn't hit all that well. And I don't know how to disentangle the two. Maybe he just wasn't the same after the concussion. There's also been concerns about his bat speed. Now, Dodgers being the Dodgers, of course, they have another catcher coming up behind those guys. But my point was that catching depth is the least sure thing to have. So it's great to get it because it feels like you have to have 4 catching prospects to end up with one really good one and maybe a couple of backups. And if you end up in that situation, like you described, where you have 2, you can trade one. Look at the Pirates. Pirates a year ago, Henry Davis isn't going to catch because they have Endy Rodriguez, who is a better catcher than Davis. And then Endy gets hurt. So now Davis is going to catch. And I'm sure they're thinking, wow, thank goodness we had 2 viable catchers in the big leagues. And that actually, as it works out for them, Davis is going to get the extended time on the plate they'll need to decide if he can be the catcher for them long term.
We're driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Just go to Indeed.com/Blue Wire right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
The Black preaching tradition is deeply connected to gospel music.
PBS presents a new series hosted by Henry Louis Gates Jr., Gospel.
Our singers preach and our preachers sing.
Gospel is a prayer. It is our heart's cry to God in lyrics and song.
You feel it deep down in your soul.
Gospel. Streaming now on the PBS app.
The other thing that jumped out to me about your list is that when we were forming our top 10 list at Sox Machine, James Fegan and I, we both saw the system as having a consensus number 1 prospect and a consensus number 6 prospect in Jacob Gonzalez. And then you upended that by placing Jake Eder 6th and placing Gonzalez 7th. So that was my fist shaking moment at you of like, how dare you? But like Jake Eder is a guy I just, based on how he looked at the White Sox, given the kind of end of the Kenny Williams era and all the talk about how Williams made the trade over the wishes of his front office and just the, it feels like a parting gift from that era that could just like linger. So, going in, putting my vibes in the ranking, because I do put vibes in the ranking because sometimes that's all I have. I just, as far as Eder at the White Sox, did not see anything that made me want to put him ahead of Gonzalez or like, towards the top half of the list. But obviously he does have a history that predates the White Sox, and so you have to take that into account. But like, Where do you stand on like obviously you ranked him where you ranked him, which is 6th. And you said that he is probably a reliever unless he can improve the changeup and strike throwing overall. But like for White Sox fans who just saw him basically at his worst while healthy and being able to throw, like, what are we going to look for? Where, I guess, what are we hoping for? Where is the optimism?
Right before he got hurt, he was the best pitching prospect in the Marlins system, maybe the best prospect in their system. I think it was right before the emergence of Yuri Perez. I may be getting the chronology just slightly off there. He certainly passed Max Meyer from that same draft class. And then Eder got hurt, and it was a little bit of a long road back. I don't think he was 100% back even last year, which was his first actual year back pitching. He showed the stuff. He didn't show the command, the control. Sometimes those do take a little bit longer to come back. I also love the idea of just getting him out of the Marlins system to try to, all right, let's get him in a different program. Let's try some different things. This guy, he was a prospect going all the way back to high school. He's always had a good arm. He's always been able to spin it. He's always had velocity. That stuff had just kept picking up, and then the elbow blew. I'm sure those things are a little bit connected as well. So he does have a history pre-surgery of being a lot better than what we saw. I think you have a lot to work with there. I think he's got the size, the delivery, the arm strength, the feel to spin. Look, I'm hedging my bet a little bit, and it's probably a reliever based on what we saw last year, and that he has never actually had that full season of pitching like an elite starting pitching prospect. Fully acknowledge that. But I see a lot of paths to upside there. The thing with Gonzalez, and I am not ever going to argue like, 6 and 7 have to be that way. 7 and 6, sure, flip them. Those aren't the decisions I spend.
I will bend you to my will.
On. Right. But like it's 6 versus 16. Those are the things you make sure you get right. But, on Gonzalez, I saw him in the spring. I was like, he's a good college player. And then I saw the rest of the draft. Excuse me. I saw him very early. And, then I'd see Braden Taylor and I'd see Brock Wilkin. And I kept seeing guys. I'm like, God, these guys are all way better. All these other hitters, they're hitting the ball much except Jacob Wilson. Everyone else is hitting the ball harder, and they're showing more athleticism, or they're showing more power. They're showing better plate discipline. Suddenly Gonzalez just kept creeping down. It's, wow, I like these other guys quite a bit more in comparison. It was kind of an epic draft class for college position players, and we may not see another one like it for a long time. Then Gonzalez goes out to pro ball, and obviously he didn't perform great. This isn't really about performance, particularly in a tiny sample like that. What did alarm me was the number of scouts who reached out to me because they saw Gonzalez and said, how the hell is this guy a first rounder or some variation thereof? They just crushed him. Like, that's an extra guy. Doesn't look like he can hit. There's no impact. They're moving him off shortstop. It was alarming. I do not get reports that bad on guys right out of the draft. The occasional, not on a high pick, right? There's always the third rounder, the high school kid where it's like, well, he stinks. Sure, that happens. We can make those mistakes on teenage players. For an SEC product like that to go out and look bad, not just play badly, but look bad in his first, whatever it was, 30-odd games in pro ball, that's pretty alarming. It's in my history, that's really exceptional. What I hear a lot more of is, I can't believe this guy didn't go higher. Those are the calls, the texts I get a lot more of. And those are fun. Colt Emerson with the Mariners was one of those where it's, oh man, the Mariners took him, I think it was 22nd or 23rd, and they may have gotten the steal of the draft. But those are much more common versus, hey, this guy's just out of college, it's been a long season, et cetera. Oh, he stinks. Nobody actually used that word, but I mean, that's what they were thinking. That's pretty alarming, actually. And I will say, go ahead.
I was wondering, do they take that into account, like just the long season? Do they bake in a little bit of fatigue or preparing to be underwhelmed a little bit before they start like actually sounding alarms?
I do. I think you should. When I see those guys after the draft, which often I do because I live in an area where there's a lot of A-ball teams around me. So those guys do tend to show up. I saw Dylan Cruz, who's the second pick. They skipped him over Wilmington where I live. So I drove up to Harrisburg to catch him there. And he didn't look great. And he's still in my top 10. Like he looked tired, I thought. I do have a little bit of a question. Like, I think fastballs at the top of the zone are going to give him some trouble. That is not, also he was a SEC product, college guy who was in AA, which is awfully fast. But you saw a lot of guys from this draft class go out to high A, AA. I think 2 guys got to AAA and kept posting all the way up through that last stop. So it's a little bit concerning that Gonzalez played badly and looked bad doing it when his peers were doing so well in the same kind of trial. So I'm not dismissing what you say. I do think that's real. I think the fatigue issue is absolutely real. And I do think we have to keep that in mind. It is more about, in Gonzalez's case, the tools. They were saying, like, there's not great bat speed. There's certainly not running speed. It's not elite defense at short. He's not impacting the ball. It was a very quick and very stark difference between what pro scouts thought and what amateurs thought. And the point I was going to make is that felt like a very last regime pick. Mm-hmm. And obviously they did Colson Montgomery and they did Noah Schultz. I have suspicions that Schultz, which looks like a great pick, and I'm not taking anything away, if he wasn't in their backyard, would they have done that? I don't know. I may never know the answer to that. But Jacob Gonzalez was a very Kenny Williams walking into the draft room saying you need to take a college position player. The Jake Berger pick. Jake Berger ended up in the big leagues, and he's okay. But I don't think that's who the scouts wanted at the time. And I think we may have even talked about it when they fired the GM, when they fired Kenny and Rick Hahn. I got a lot of stories from ex-White Sox people talking about all of the nonsense that went on in the draft room, all the interference where the scouting staff would want one player and somebody above them would come in and say, nope, you have to do such and such more conservative thing. And that is something I will be looking for with Getz. Does he let the scouts do their job? And you can incorporate that with your R&D department. You can have a draft model. That's fine. Mm-hmm. But let them take who they want to take. Do not walk in and say you have to take some vanilla college position player with decent numbers when the scouts want to shoot a little bit higher, especially because you know that first round pick, that's your chance. It's your chance to get a Colson Montgomery. And if you got a shot at a guy like that, you better take it. And I feel like I just look at all the guys they passed on last year. From, I mentioned Braden Taylor was available, Brock Wilken was available, Colt Emerson was still available. There were a lot of good players still on the board who they could have taken and who were known at the time to be good players like that. I'm not even talking about players who went much later who looked really good afterwards and we're saying so-and-so should have gone in the first round. Players they could have been considering with that actual pick.
After like the 6 and 7 spots on the prospect list, like it really opens up. When I was trying to put together the list, like a lot of players who I didn't have strong attachments to, but kind of interested in. And you went with Tanner McDougal in the first spot for the 8th of that aftermath of the kind of consensus picks. And, watching his season alongside Peyton Pallette, they were on the same program of throwing like 3 to 4 innings or 65 pitches or so every 6 days, like not every 5 days. Like, I don't think they started like twice in a week if the schedule, would have allowed to do it. And I think it's good for McDougal that he was keeping pace with Pallette, but not good for Pallette that McDougal is keeping pace with him. That's kind of my read on those two situations. So we're
that's fair.
Yeah, like it's, given an Arkansas starter like McDougal keeping, looking like Pallette did, great for McDougal, maybe not great for Pallette. And like now here comes Grant Taylor, another shot at that SEC player coming off Tommy John surgery and rehabbing, in regular season games. I
did think it was interesting that they went right back to the same well. And I want to give Pallette another year. He didn't look good. I didn't see him. This is from scouts who saw him. A lot of disappointment, especially the thing I worry about the most with this blithe assumption. It's like, he had Tommy John, he'll be fine. Like, they don't all come back the same. And a lot of pitchers, especially pitchers who had really good breaking balls, come back and that 70 breaking balls of 55. Lucas Giolito was one of those. Jay Groom was one of those. It actually remains to be seen. Dylan Lesko didn't have any elite curveball, but he had a very high spin curveball. He was up to like 2,900 RPMs the day that he broke. I happened to be there. And does that come all the way back? Folks who saw Lesko last year said velocity was good. The changeup is elite once again. Curveball remains a work in progress. We'll see. Worry about that with Pallette. And I worry about that generally where we're just like, we can just take a Tommy John guy. Yeah, some of them come back at 100%. Most guys come back enough to be close to what they were before. To major league pitcher before is probably going to be a major league pitcher afterwards. There are some guys who don't come back. Gunnar Hoglund in the Oakland system, stuff just never came back. He was a first rounder, got traded in the Matt Chapman trade from Toronto to Oakland. It's just not coming. It's just not happening. And that we don't hear a lot about those stories, but they do exist. And I worry with Pallette less about, give him another year. Arm strength might get a little bit better. Command and control often do get a little bit better that second year. But if the breaking ball's not what it was before, if I remember correctly, that was kind of the pitch. So that's a little disappointing. With McDougal, I have really good notes on him. And people who pro scouts who obviously hadn't seen him before because he was hurt were having a little bit of, where'd this guy come from? not like they'd never heard of him, but he beat their expectations. And it was somebody specifically said, arrow pointing upward on that one. It was the actual expression. Okay, that's a good one. Slide him up a little bit on the rankings. And also, I just pulled him up myself too. When I look at the names that are right behind him, it's a lot of guys who are very likely relievers, or, in Taylor's case, like, we just don't really know. We'll see what it looks like, because I'm reading my own words here. He had a hammer curveball. I hope it comes back. I hope it's still there. But I worry about breaking balls not coming back much more than I worry about velocity, because they all seem to, most of them seem to regain enough of the velocity. It's much more common to leave the breaking ball in the operating room than it is to leave the big fastball.
Yeah, after the top 7, I went with Wilfred Veras, who, I'm falling for the White Sox hitting prospect with the massive strikeout to walk disparity. And I fully admit that, and it's probably going to blow up in my face. But, and that's always a key word, but, and here's where you fall back into it. The two things that surprised me, or two things that stand out, I should say, is one, age for level. Like, he's produced everywhere he's gone, given some aggressive assignments and held up. Yep. And so points for that. The contact is always loud and entertaining, or often is loud and entertaining. The other thing that's jumped out to me watching him in person last year was he's faster than I thought. But it's funny, like, it shows up on the base paths, but not in the outfield. Like, on the base paths, there's a lot more decisiveness. He's not afraid to steal bases or take the extra base. And, like, for a future DH or a guy who's fighting to stay off first base DH, like, he can actually run a little. But then when you watch him in the outfield, it's very cautious. Like, we've seen worse, because the White Sox believe in playing first baseman in right field. Like, we've seen far worse on a regular basis.
They're just trying to condition you. Yeah,
pretty much. But, like, so I've seen worse, but it is like, there is hesitancy. The closing speed isn't great. Like, the kind of cautious lines to make sure the ball doesn't get behind him. When it comes to, like, trying to figure out if a guy can play the outfield, if he has the foot speed to do so, which I think Veras does, how hard it is, or like, how much of it is it art versus science when it comes to kind of figuring out whether he can actually get comfortable enough to turn into a good outfielder versus an outfielder who can only run when the ball's in the gap and he knows he has to?
The scouts I talked to, who, typically spend 6 games or more watching the player, came back and said, he's athletic enough for a corner. That's not to say he's a good corner outfielder right now, but there's no physical reason he can't do it. And so then it becomes a question of, honestly, of instruction and instincts. Does he have the aptitude? Can he learn things like, it seems like reads are probably a bigger question than routes, where if he's less tentative because he's getting a good read off the bat, then he will run a little bit faster, because, like you said, he's actually a better runner than you would think. And then that athleticism would start to play a little bit more. And that comes back to some of the player development questions you and I have been talking about for a while now. And do the new folks who've taken over with Getz moving up to the big chair, how are they going to do with teaching outfield defense, with taking a guy like this with the physical tools and teaching him to become a better outfielder? I think we have a lot of examples, like you just said, of them not teaching people to become better outfielders, or just taking literally anybody and sticking them in an outfield corner.
Hopeless cases.
You can figure this out. Yeah. And, in a case like Andrew Vaughn, you never really want to say, well, that's on the coaching staff. I mean, it's never going to work. Nobody thought.
Gavin Sheets.
Another one. Yes. I mean, I walked behind Gavin Sheets at the ACC tournament in his draft year, and I was like, that is first base only. Like, you could just see from the legs, like, that is a man born to play first base. He really is. Christina Carl once referred to the pillar of salt technique of defense, and I was like, yep, that's this guy. It is. It takes him a long time to turn 90 degrees, and I hope he can hit. And, with Veras, he's not like that. He's physically able. I mean, I would also say, I don't know that the White Sox have had a ton of guys like that. I think of Micker Adolfo. It's just a bad example, because Adolfo came in, by all accounts, not actually knowing the rules of baseball. So you could not start from lower. I wish Adolfo had gotten a little further. I give that kid and the White Sox coaches who worked with him so much credit for how far he did get from knowing absolutely nothing to be able to play at AAA. But do they have a lot of examples? I may be forgetting someone of guys like Veras. He's got some baseball, some feel for the game. It's not terribly advanced. He's athletic enough to be able, we're just asking you to play right field. It's not a whole lot more than that, but he's not there yet. I don't know that we have a whole lot of examples of that. The White Sox approach, it's so funny because their draft approach for years was just take the finished product. And then the international market, they would take the most unfinished products they could possibly find. Neither of which worked out particularly well for them, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually had that thought, like maybe it's kind of a simulation of what if Adolfo were perfectly healthy, because Veras has been, healthy, knock on wood, he's been healthy the entire time and able to get the games in early and make the most of them. The other one I thought of was like poor man's Eloy Jimenez. Like just, because watching Jimenez in the futures game, watching him play right field and actually make a close and a catch down the right field line and realize like, you're thinking like, and then watching him a few years later, I mean like, ooh, that disappeared.
Yeah. It was like somebody just like gave him like a slow injection or something. I mean, his body slowed down extremely quickly. And then it turned out it's like, oh, he's just a worse outfielder than I ever realized. I remember that in the futures game. Damn, he got on his horse for that one. I swear he never did it again.
Yeah, well, he did it a couple of years ago, but it was a catch in the gap where he absolutely had to run in one direction. Like there was no hesitation. And so like it was the second toughest catch made by a White Sox player that year. Luis Robert Jr. had the first, but like he made that catch, but it's because like his body told him like, I have to go. Like there's no doubt about this. He ended up closing it. But yeah, so those are the two guys I have in mind for like simulations with Veras. And that's why I'm, intrigued enough to put him, seventh, but also like
totally
just
fair, by the way,
wide open kind of.
There's in no way, and Veras was 19th on my list. In no way would I argue that you are wrong to have him seventh.
Yeah.
I agree with you. You've got your top five, which are very clear. And then you could jumble. I mean, I wouldn't put like Gonzalez 19th, but you have a lot of variability in the rest of the list. And somebody even commented under my article today, and I didn't respond because he kind of had a point. He's like, hey, Keith says he really likes the system, but after the top five, sounds kind of tepid on a lot of these guys. I'm like, well, he's not wrong. And maybe I'm a little bit biased in the sense that it hasn't been going that well, and now things are actually going pretty well. But I also look through this list and it's like, no, there's a lot of names here I kind of like Jordan Ledger. He's a straight up reliever, but for folks who haven't seen him, like, it's two of the best pitches in the system. It's crazy how good this guy is. If you thought this delivery would work as a starter, he'd be absolutely fascinating. It is 100% reliever, but it is a big fastball that's got a huge ride at the top of the zone, and this slider that is just an absolute hammer. He could come up this year and miss a whole lot of bats. And the system has a lot of guys like that. It's like he's just a reliever. That does put a bit of a cap on his value, but I might really like him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're kind of fun. Like we've seen White Sox systems where like after 10, it stops being fun.
Oh my God. It's like, it was like, how do I get to 20? Right. And there's somebody every year who's like that. White Sox had several years that were like that. And I mean, I know you do this too, right? Where you're just like, I ran out of names. Like I'm writing up guys who are like seventh starters and guys who'd never make a top 20 in another system. That was not true this year. This might be I think this is the most guys, because I had a little others of note section. I don't do that for every team because you have to have others of note. And they did. They had a bunch, actually. And I think it's the most names I've ever written up in a White Sox system, or close to it, which again is sort of, you know what? We could spend a lot more time. We don't need to talking about what went wrong in the Williams-Hahn era. The cupboard wasn't bare when they left. There was stuff to work with. The last batch of trades worked out pretty well. They had a couple of decent drafts. I like the way things are heading, but I'm also glad they handed it off to someone else now to kind of carry this forward into the next few years, where there's going to be some more pain and there's going to be some more building.
I'm going to wrap up the White Sox talk with one guy you didn't mention among all the names you mentioned in your rankings, even honorable mentions. Like one guy who wasn't on that list, and one I'm fascinated by is Brooks Baldwin. I don't know how much you have on him, but the thing that jumped out to me was, UNC Wilmington and kind of utility guy there, utility guy for the first couple of years in the system until he goes to Winston-Salem. And then he's an everyday shortstop and doing it seemingly okay. And he's also hitting, he's switch hitter, and like the performance is good. So like, to me, like, I don't know what to do with him. I didn't rank him, but I just have him like, he's on my radar. Just like, this is a weird wrinkle. You don't see this too often where all of a sudden a guy starts playing shortstop. Do you have a read on him yet? Or do you have like Is that common to have like shortstop just show up in high A when it really wasn't part of a profile before?
Yeah, I actually just checked his games, his fielding. Like he was primarily third baseman. And in Kannapolis this year, I don't mean by in his life.
Yeah.
I mean in the first half of last season. I had nothing on the quality of his shortstop play for Winston-Salem. So you keep that caveat in mind. Obviously, he hit there like he'd never hit before, which always makes me kind of immediately suspicious, where it's just a small sample. And for a guy to move up a level and then hit that much better, all right, that may not sustain. But I could also understand saying, well, let's keep an eye on this one, right? Especially if he actually can play shortstop, it's not unheard of for a guy who you just end up kind of miscast because there are other players, or in his case, he was a low draft pick, right? So he's never going to get the priority job. They were moving him around. He moved around quite a bit. He was a 12th round pick, and he moved until he got to Winston-Salem. They were just moving him all over the place. I wonder, I'd have to ask, did you just stick him at shortstop because you didn't have anybody else? That's okay. It's okay to say we didn't know he could do it. It is interesting that they left him there basically every day for the rest of the season. He'd be one worth catching up with, because even if he doesn't hit, like, I don't think he's going to hit 320. He hasn't hit like that. UNC Wilmington plays in a very low caliber conference. But if he can actually play shortstop, suddenly you're immediately talking about a utility infielder floor, right? Because he can play all over. He's shown he can play a bunch of these other positions. If he can just hit a little bit and he can handle shortstop on more than an emergency basis, that is a prospect with value. But whether it's top 20 or not, it is a player who has some value. And I mean, this I would come back to the reader's comment I was mentioning before. There's value in having a bunch of guys who look like pretty good relievers, fourth outfielders, utility infielders. Can't build the whole house out of those things, but you do have to have them. You don't want to be going out paying for it.
The White Sox have tried.
Yeah, it doesn't work, as it turns out, right? The big bad wolf comes and blows the whole thing down. So I am fine with them having a lot of those guys in the system. I'm glad you brought Baldwin up, because I fully admit I don't have anything on him as a shortstop, and I'll be watching too, because if it turns out he can play shortstop, that's pretty interesting. I mean, that changes the entire profile, even if it is just from a utility infield perspective, because I had this conversation with a scout. There's the utility infielder who can play shortstop and the utility guy who can't play shortstop. And there is a big difference in our era where teams are carrying so many pitchers, where if you're a utility infielder who can't play shortstop, you better do something really special somewhere else, because teams just don't have room to carry you.
And to finally wrap up, as we always do with your appearances, like to get a book recommendation from you. I am reading The Power Broker right now. I'm going with the 99% Invisible Book Club that's doing 100 pages a month and having episodes about it every month and bringing people in to talk about it. And I think that's the only way I'll ever read The Power Broker, is having a chunk at a time and having people remind me of what I read and why it's great.
Is that the Robert Moses book?
Am I thinking the right one? 1,300 pages or so, depending on what copy you have.
I mean, I grew up going to Moses Beach. I just cannot I just have this antipathy towards, I know what he did. I know who that guy was. I don't need to read 1,000 pages about what a terrible human he was.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, but it's but my favorite podcast, it's like a book I'll never read otherwise, so I'm going to tackle it that way. So I'm in the middle of that right now. But what do you have that is not Robert Moses related?
Sure.
That other people might not have lingering trauma about.
The next book I'm going to read, I've not started it. I just finished a book last night. It's The Great Fire, which was a National Book Award winner like 20 years ago, I think, by Shirley Hazard. The book I will recommend is also interesting because it's been in the news. Babel by R.F. Kuang, Kuang. It's Babel, Babel, which is a work of speculative fiction. It won the Nebula Award for Best Novel, and it is it's really literate, intelligent, thoughtful, creative. The idea she uses, it plays with the trope of the magic school, the kid who gets sort of inducted into magic school. She's messing with that just as the basic template, and writes a much darker and very politically astute novel about colonialism and exploitation and the rights and responsibilities of the privileged parts of the world to do something good for the remainder of the world. And it made the news recently because it was very weirdly and suspiciously omitted, in fact, declared ineligible for the Hugo Award. The Nebula and the Hugo are kind of the two big sci-fi fantasy awards of the year. And winning one of those awards can mean a lot for sales. She wins the Nebula. And when the Hugo Awards come out, she doesn't win. Fine. Okay. Nobody wins every award typically.
So like Golden Globes and Oscars type where
it's kind of
connection,
right?
but
sometimes if you win, sometimes the same book will win both, but usually it's different. The Pulitzer and the National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, usually it's 3 different winners, and that's good. That actually spreads the wealth a little bit. But when the actual vote results came out for the Hugos, turned out it was declared ineligible, and nobody knows why. Well, fun fact, the Hugos, the Worldcon, which is the convention where the Hugos are voted on, was held in Chengdu, China. And R.F. Kuang is Chinese by descent and has written some works that you might interpret as critical of the Chinese communist regime. And there is at least a strong suspicion that the Chinese government directly or indirectly influenced the organizers of the vote and had several things declared ineligible, although no one has ever actually, to this point, this has only been a couple of weeks, this has been out there at all. No one has truly come forward with a full explanation. It's been a huge ongoing scandal. I encourage folks to read about it because it's also really fascinating. I like a good scandal. And one of the Sandman episodes was also declared ineligible, and Neil Gaiman is appropriately pissed off about it. There was another short story collection that was declared ineligible because I believe that was also a Chinese national or Chinese descended writer. I mean, this is more than just this one book. Babel is the one I've read, and it was pretty great, actually. And it's a quick read for 500 something pages. And I love that you walk in, and if you've read Harry Potter or the Magician series or any of it, you know the template, right? You're like, I know where we're going with this. And then she just keeps going. She just keeps pulling the rug out from under you and going in a different direction. And I was just completely hooked by the story, but also constantly aware, wow, there's a ton of meaning and metaphor in here. And it's just impressive. She's obviously an extremely intelligent person, in addition to being a great writer. The amount of, or the depth of themes that were going on here was comparable to great works of non-genre literature, which to me is like, I like genre literature. I think it can rival great literature of all eras. And I think that's really what she's done here in Babel, is written something that has deep, deep meaning, but is also just compulsively readable.
I'm blanking on the book you recommended before that was along the same lines, like 1,100 pages.
Was it Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell?
That's the one.
Okay, yeah. Which was a Hugo winner, actually.
Yes.
And
became along the same lines, and that's not normally my genre, but enjoyed it. And it was a quick read for that many pages.
The footnotes are great. Actually, Babel has a lot of footnotes too. Babel's footnotes are not funny. The Jonathan Strange's footnotes are often very funny. And because she wrote Piranesi, I wonder if we might have been talking about Piranesi as well, which was the author of Jonathan Strange she had some health issues, and then something like 16 years later returned with her second novel, and it was also wonderful. It was much shorter, but Jonathan Strange is just an all-time. I mean, I said it was my favorite novel written this century, and that would still be true. I think I wrote that a year ago, and I would still hold to that. That is just an incredible work of art.
Well, as always, we really appreciate your time here. I appreciate that every time I set up an appointment with you, that I try to set up for a little bit longer to account for the time we go over, and yet we go over again. So always appreciate the generosity of time, and I look forward next year to comparing notes. And I'm preparing for Wilfred Veras to break my heart, but I'm hoping that maybe Brooks Baldwin on the back end. You heard it from me first.
I will be watching for him. I may not be in Winston-Salem. Actually, might just bump him up to Birmingham, but you can be rest assured, at the very least, when I go out to spring training and go over to Glendale, I would be looking specifically for Brooks Baldwin because of you.
Excellent. Thanks again.
My pleasure.
Thanks as always to Keith Law. You can find his work at The Athletic, along with his board game reviews at Paste, and everything else at his personal blog at meadowparty.com. He's a true Renaissance man. As for Sox Machine, James Fegan and I teamed up for our top 10 prospects list that includes 12 players. So if that's not value, I don't know what is. That post is available at soxmachine.com, exclusively those who support Sox Machine on Patreon. Speaking of Patreon, it's a good time to sign up because James just arrived at spring training, and a lot of what he's writing will be exclusive to supporters because it's our subscriber support that makes sending James on road trips possible, and we want them to reap the benefits. If that sounds like a good deal to you, head on over to patreon.com/Sox Machine, where you can access an ad-free version of the website and Sox Machine podcast with bonus content on both. For instance, this episode featured 5 extra minutes of Keith answering a couple questions from our supporters. Plans start at $5 a month, with 1 month free if you sign up for a year. Thanks for listening to the Sox Machine Podcast, a production of SoxMachine.com and part of the Blue Wire Podcast Network. I'm Jim Margulis. Thanks for listening.